Today in the Daily Dose, Jim Crow laws in the segregated South. Named after a black minstrel show character, Jim Crow laws were a collection of mostly Southern state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation, which were implemented shortly after the end of the Civil War and lasted until the civil rights protests and federal legislation of the 1960s. The laws were intended to marginalize African Americans by suppressing their right to vote, limiting their access to good-paying jobs, while excluding access to higher education. Those who attempted to shirk the laws often faced arrest, fines, jail time, violence, and even death. In 1896, the first legal attempt to repeal Jim Crow laws was upheld in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, in which the U.S. Supreme Court laid out its separate but equal doctrine, affirming racial segregation in public facilities, including the coaches of interstate trains and buses. Facilities for African Americans were routinely inferior and underfunded compared to facilities maintained exclusively for whites. While the laws as a whole institutionalized economic, educational, and social disadvantages for African Americans living in the South, segregation was also adhered to in the U.S. military, while in 1913, Southern Democratic President Woodrow Wilson initiated national segregation policies in federal workplaces. Southern statutes continued to impose poll taxes on Black Americans, attempting to suppress them from voting in local, state, and national elections. In 1954, segregation of state-funded public schools was declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court under Chief Justice Earl Warren in the landmark case Brown v. Board of Education. Yet most Southern states dragged their feet for years before integration was finally achieved, against great backlash from white Southerners. In 1964, the Warren Court continued to rule against Jim Crow laws in other cases such as Heart of Atlanta Motel Inc. versus United States. The last vestiges of Jim Crow laws came to an end when they were overruled by the Civil Rights Act of 1964, followed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, bringing to an end white America's long and stained history of racial suppression against Black Americans. Today in the Daily Dose, Malcolm X. Born Malcolm Little in 1925, Omaha, Nebraska, Malcolm X dropped out of school after the 8th grade, earning the nickname Detroit Red for dealing drugs in flashy zoot suits. Convicted of larceny at age 21, during his 6-year prison sentence, Malcolm X was exposed to the teachings of Nation of Islam leader Elijah Muhammad, who preached that white people were the devil. Abandoning his slave name for the simple last name of X, after his release from prison, Malcolm became the minister of Harlem's Mosque No. 7, where his skills as an orator grew the Nation of Islam from 400 members in 1952 to over 40,000 by 1960, including an African-American heavyweight boxer who changed his name from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali.
We declare our right on this earth to be a man, to be a human being, to be respected as a human being, to be given the rights of a human being in this society, on this earth, in this day, which we intend to bring into existence by any means necessary.
The injustice that has been inflicted upon Negroes in this country by Uncle Sam is criminal. I'm not an integrationist, never could be. I couldn't integrate with my enemy, and I know who my enemy is.
We don't want to have anything to do with any race of dog, two-legged dog, that will sick four-legged dogs on innocent, harmless women, children, and babies.
An advocate for achieving racial equality by any means necessary, his persistent calls for violence against the white man placed him at odds with Martin Luther King Jr.'s insistence on nonviolent protest during the height of the Civil Rights Movement, at the same time placing Malcolm X on the FBI's watch list of subversives, prompting Bureau Chief J. Edgar Hoover to encourage New York agents to do something about Malcolm X. Suspended from the Nation of Islam over his charge of corruption within the organization, in 1964, Malcolm traveled to Mecca, where he experienced a profound spiritual transformation, including his eventual name change to El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz. Founding the Organization of Afro-American Unity in June of 1964, Malcolm X's adoption of a more moderate philosophy soon found resonance with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, after he identified racism instead of the white race as the true enemy of justice. Less than a year later, on February 21, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated by Nation of Islam members during a unity rally at the Audubon Ballroom in New York City, a revenge killing for Malcolm's public criticism of Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, making the short yet impassioned life of Malcolm X one of the leading voices during the Civil Rights Movement in America. Today in the Daily Dose, Medgar Evers. Born in 1925 Decatur, Mississippi, Medgar Evers served with the U.S. Army during World War II, participating in the D-Day invasions at Normandy, France, before enrolling in present-day Alcorn State University, graduating in 1952 with a Bachelor of Arts degree in Business Administration. Moving to Mound Bayou, Mississippi with his young wife Merle, Evers worked as a salesman for the Magnolia Mutual Life Insurance Company, at the same time becoming president of the Regional Council of Negro Leadership, where his civil rights activism led to the boycott of Mississippi gas stations that banned blacks from using their restrooms. Following the Supreme Court's 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision, which ruled that segregated public schools were unconstitutional, Evers submitted his application as a test case to the state-supported University of Mississippi Law School, which was summarily rejected due to the color of his skin.
And they want me to tell you that we don't need nigger business. These are stories that help to support the White Citizens Council, the council that is dedicated to keeping you and I second-class citizens. Now, finally, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be demonstrating here until freedom comes to Negroes here in Jackson, Mississippi.
That same year, Evers was named the first NAACP Field Secretary of Mississippi, where his mounting civil rights activism, including his public investigation of the 1955 murder of Emmett Till, Evers and his young family lived with the constant threat of death from racist white hate groups, including the White Citizens Council created to block segregation of public schools, and the Ku Klux Klan. In May of 1963, a Molotov cocktail was thrown into the carport of his Jackson home, while on June 7th of that same year, Evers was nearly run down by a car after leaving the Jackson office of the NAACP. 5 days later, just hours after President John F. Kennedy delivered a nationally televised civil rights address, Evers was assassinated by avowed segregationist Byron de la Beckwith, who was subsequently acquitted by 2 all-white juries in February and April of 1964.
I believe in extermination of all that opposes the white, right, Christian side of every issue. It's like Martin Luther King. You know, nobody has had any trouble with Martin Luther King since they put him in the coffin.
Refusing to give up the fight for justice for her fallen husband, Merle Evers sought a retrial based on new evidence in 1994, leading to Beckwith's February 5th conviction of murder, a full 3 decades after he ended Evers' life with a World War I-era Eddystone Enfield rifle. Beckwith appealed his conviction in 1997, which was later upheld by the Mississippi Supreme Court, passing away in prison on January 21, 2001, making the activist life and tragic death of Medgar Evers an early ignition point in a nation's slow embrace of equal rights. Today in the Daily Dose, Martin Luther King Jr.'s final speech. On Wednesday, April 3, 1968, the community of Memphis, Tennessee spent the day under siege by strong winds and violent thunderstorms. After a bomb threat had delayed his flight from Atlanta, Martin Luther King Jr. and his contemporaries from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference checked in at the Lorraine Hotel in advance of a sanitation workers' rally at the Mason Temple that night, followed by a planned protest march the following Monday. Doc, as he was affectionately known to his colleagues, checked into his usual room at the Lorraine, room 306, with his habitual roommate Ralph Abernathy at his side. Out on the rain-soaked streets, the Memphis police set up a dragnet around the hotel, doing what they could to protect the famed Nobel laureate and civil rights legend from untold threats by white racists intent on silencing MLK's message of nonviolent protest. Barely installed in room 306, 2 officers from the Memphis Sheriff's Department arrived to serve Dr. King with an injunction issued by the Fifth Circuit Court of Tennessee, indicating that next Monday's planned sanitation workers' march had been banned. Combined with the bomb threat, Doc asked Abernathy and Jesse Jackson to stand in for him at the Mason Temple that night, while he turned in early for some much-needed sleep. Hours later, Doc awakened to the sound of his hotel room phone, and when he answered it, Abernathy informed him that the overcapacity crowd at the temple refused to take no for an answer regarding the morale-boosting speech by the civil rights legend. In response, Doc dressed in a suit and cabbed over to the church for what would become his final speech before his life was unjustly ended the following day.
What we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. So just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
The next day, stealing off with Abernathy for lunch at one of MLK's favorite fried catfish joints, Doc confessed to his friend that he hadn't prepared for last night's monumental speech, but rather he let the Holy Spirit guide his thoughts and words. 6 hours later, while departing the Lorraine Hotel for a planned dinner at a local reverend's home, Doc received the worst injustice when an assassin's bullet found its mark. Today on the Daily Dose, Plessy v. Ferguson. After the Compromise of 1877 ended post-Civil War Reconstruction efforts in the South, Southern blacks saw the promise of equality granted to them by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments crushed under a rising tide of segregationist black codes. Much like the Freedom Riders of 1961, who would follow their lead, who used whites-only facilities in bus terminals as a stress test to the Supreme Court's 1960 Boynton v. Virginia ruling declaring segregation inside interstate transportation facilities unconstitutional, after Louisiana mandated segregated railway cars in 1890, backed by other pre-civil rights movement activists. Homer Adolph Plessy agreed to set out by train to challenge the new law, boarding a whites-only rail car on June 7, 1892, departing New Orleans for the sleepy North Shore community of Covington, Louisiana. Despite his mixed-race ethnicity, Plessy claiming he was 7/8 Caucasian, when a conductor insisted he leave the car, Plessy refused, leading to his prompt arrest and imprisonment. Convicted by a New Orleans court for violating state law, Plessy filed a petition against the Honorable John H. Ferguson, the presiding judge over his trial, claiming that the state's 1890 law violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and as segregationist laws continued to accelerate throughout the Jim Crow South, including congressional nullification of many Reconstruction-era laws, Plessy's persistent tenacity elevated his case to the Supreme Court. On May 18, 1896, the Supreme Court at last issued its ruling on Plessy v. Ferguson, declaring that separate but equal facilities were indeed constitutional on intrastate railroads, insisting that the protections laid down by the 14th Amendment applied solely to political and civil rights freedoms, such as voting and jury duty, yet had no bearing over, as the justices phrased it, social rights freedoms. Addressing Plessy's argument that segregated black rail cars were necessarily inferior, Justice Henry Brown wrote that we consider the underlying fallacy of Plessy's argument to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation of the two races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority. If this be so, it is not by reason of anything found in the Act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it, making Plessy v. Ferguson an open-season invitation for white racism in America. Today on the Daily Dose, the Poor People's Campaign. In November of 1967, Martin Luther King Jr. and his Southern Christian Leadership Conference decided to undertake the Poor People's Campaign in an attempt to demand economic justice for the nation's poor.
We read one day, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But if a man doesn't have a job or an income, he has neither life nor liberty and the possibility for the pursuit of happiness. He merely exists. Estimated that we spend $322,000 for each enemy we kill in Vietnam, while we spend in the so-called war on poverty in America only about $53 for each person classified as poor.
After King's unjust assassination on April 4, 1968, which led to widespread rioting in most major American cities, King's longtime friend and fellow civil rights activist, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, stepped in to fulfill King's vision of a mass protest on Washington, D.C., while the Reverend Jesse Jackson stepped in as city manager to what would become known as Resurrection City. Busloads of a broad coalition of Native Americans, white, Latino, and African Americans began arriving into the district on May 12, 1968, occupying the 15-acre makeshift tent city near the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument, holding daily protests against federal lawmakers' dogged inaction on poverty. For the next 6 weeks, some 2,700 protesters endured harsh living conditions, including rain, mud, heat, and high humidity, as well as frequent clashes with police. The beleaguered demonstration culminated with the Poor People's March of June 19, 1968, with an estimated 50,000 people in attendance, including speeches by Vice President Hubert Humphrey, Democratic presidential candidate Eugene McCarthy, Abernathy, and King's widow, Coretta Scott King. Distracted by ongoing racial tensions and the Vietnam War, the Poor People's Campaign came to an end on June 24th, when a 36-day permit terminated the demonstrators' legal right of assembly, and when 500 protesters refused to vacate their soggy encampment. Authorities used tear gas to disperse the remaining crowds. More than 100 protesters were arrested during the melee, including Abernathy. And while the Poor People's Campaign failed to bring about any significant anti-poverty legislation by Congress, it marked the first time that the civil rights movement expanded beyond demands for racial equality to include interracial class issues and economic goals for the nation's poor, making the Poor People's Campaign the last bold act of nonviolent protest by a nation's revered and fallen hero. And there you have it, the Poor People's Campaign, today on the Daily Dose. Get your nerd on with the Daily Dose. And if you enjoyed today's episode, share the link with a friend or colleague so that they too can learn something new every day.